So, so let us get going. Welcome to this webinar from the Rethinking Security Group, basically looking at rethinking of energy security and how the UK can achieve a just and peaceful transition. I'm Paul Rogers. I worked most of my career at Bradford University in the Peace Studies section, and I worked mainly on international security with a sort of leaning towards environmental and marginalisation issues. We have three speakers from a range of backgrounds here, and I'll introduce them briefly in the order in which they will speak. Firstly, it will be Richard Reeve, who is the coordinator of Rethinking Security. He has about 25 years experience working on aspects of international security, the last 10 years primarily on elements relating to Britain, but before that, basically in Eastern Europe, in the Sahel region of Africa, and quite a few other parts of the world. And he comes to us as the coordinator of the entire group, and most recently was the coordinator of the Oxford Research Group. Brook Dambacher basically works for the group Uplift, which is basically a rapidly growing policy group, which is all about trying to get a fossil-free UK, where she's the policy and legal advisor and also the policy lead. She has actually acted as an advisor to the group of least developed countries at the UN climate negotiations. So she has experience at that level. And then Sam Mason is the sustainability officer, a political officer at the Public and Commercial Services Union, which is actually Britain's sixth largest trade union. And she specializes in sustainability, issues of climate change, trade and international policy. And she also represents the PCSU on the Global Trade Union for the Energy Democracy Initiative. So she's operating as an international level as well. Our speakers will speak for about 8 minutes, maybe 10 maximum. So we do have time for questions and discussion towards the end. And I'm going to introduce it briefly just for 4 or 5 minutes to try and set the scene, because in a sense, we're going from a world situation through to the situation very specifically in Britain and how we can really sort out the whole issue of energy security. Starting point, a date that probably few people are aware of, hugely significant, basically in the last 50, 60 years, and that was October the 17th, back in essentially in 1973. And on that date, the Arab members of OPEC put the price of oil that they were prepared to export up by 73% overnight. It was part of an effort by the group to actually put pressure on Israel at a key time of the Yom Kippur-Ramadan war. And essentially, it was the first expression of country power, what's known as producer power, in the whole energy sector. Prior to that, in the post-war years, 1950 through to 1970, the world oil system had been controlled very large by the so-called seven majors. And they had a huge range of control with very little in the way of nationalization among the energy producers, the oil producers themselves. And in fact, the OAPEC action, and they were a group within the wider organization for petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, which we know very well, they basically used this tactic, a political tactic, and the key thing was it worked. And from then on, you had an extraordinary period between October 1973 and May 1974, in which the world price of oil went up by about 450%. And it ushered in a very different era. In fact, with the failure of many mixed economies, it gave an opportunity by the end of the decade for a huge surge in the neoliberal approach. And then the situation was made worse by the start of the Iraq-Iran war in 1980, and that essentially shoved the oil price up again. So it was a period of about 15 years, which gave us what was known as stagflation, a combination of economic stagnation and inflation at the same time. Now, I mention this because one other feature of this was by about 1980, in the face of all this change, the United States really quite radically changed aspects of its military policy. And it was actually Jimmy Carter, the president in the late 80s, who set up in the late 70s, who set up the Rapid Deployment Force. And under Ronald Reagan, that was basically metamorphosed into much more powerful Central Command, CENTCOM. And it was CENTCOM which ran all the wars that were fought later on in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and indeed in Syria and Libya. They've all come under CENTCOM. So really the origins of that whole military development have their basis in oil security, oil and gas security. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is that what we're seeing now, we've been here before, and it also means that kind of impacts we're having at the very local, personal level, matters of human security, link in at the international level as well. And so with that as just a brief introduction, let me hand over straight away to Richard to take this line of thinking forward in his own particular analysis. Richard, it's over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to talk about this subject. I want to talk about really the UK geopolitics of energy and of a green transition. And I think when you start with this question of green transition, the first question is really, surely this is a no-brainer. For the UK, what are the benefits of a green transition to renewable energy? And there's at least 6 good, clear answers to that, I think, from a very positive perspective. Firstly, green energy is cheap and getting cheaper. It has been for a long time. It's now way cheaper than pulling oil or gas out of the ground or burning fossil fuels. And that's before even the sector becomes more mature and sort of exotic technologies, perhaps like space solar or nuclear fusion or things come into the picture. Who knows where that will take us, if it will. Secondly, and also in economic terms, green tech is very much the frontier of the world's focus on energy. Therefore, there are economic and export potentials for getting in early with this technology and being able to help the rest of the world exploit it. Thirdly, there's a question of health. Clearly, not burning fossil fuels in the UK will have health benefits for the people of the UK and for the environment of both the UK and the world. Fourthly, there's the strategic question of being self-sufficient in energy, or being less or not dependent on importing your energy supplies from other parts of the world, and particularly in the case of fossil fuels, oil and gas, in being dependent on autocracies or countries that may be destabilizing, may not share your values, may be oppressing their own people. So having an ethical dimension to it. Now, obviously that's very much in the news this year in terms of Russian control of gas and energy supplies to much of Europe. The UK was never particularly dependent on Russian supplies. Most of ours comes from Norway or UK North Sea supplies. But we get a lot of our gas from Qatar, which also is obviously in the news for its own rights issues. And much of the rest of Europe is very dependent on energy supplies from North African autocracies, from Gulf states, from Russia, and other places, Venezuela, Angola, etc. So there's a benefit in that. There is also the security benefit of having the decentralized supply of energy that one tends to associate with renewables, particularly locally based renewables, as I think we should be moving towards, whether that's solar or wave power or hydroelectric or wind power, whatever it is. Small scale is much less disruptable than big infrastructure like pipelines, like mega power stations that can be more vulnerable to all kinds of disruption or attack. And finally, of course, there's the strategic value of just reducing the impact of climate change. Now, that has impacts on the UK, as we've seen with very high temperatures this summer, whether it's rising sea levels affecting cities and infrastructure, whether it's storm damage and extreme weather. We see that in the UK, but we also see that anywhere in the world. If you want to promote a more stable world, more stable societies everywhere from the poorest countries to the richest, then climate change is antithetical to that. So whatever we can do to limit global warming, climate chaos, we should be doing. So all that applies to the UK, and it also applies to most of the world. Applies less to some of the big fossil fuel exporting economies, but even there, some of these benefits apply. So really it ought to be a no-brainer that we move as fast as possible from dependence on fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy. So therefore, the big question is, why is the UK not going faster? What are the interests that are impeding this? And I think the answer to that depends quite a lot on what you understand to be the UK interest, or who the UK represents, whether that is the people of the UK, or whether it is elites in the UK and also elites internationally or transnationally influencing the UK. So what are some of those impediments? It relates a lot to how the UK sees itself as a global player and how it sees its national security interests rather than people or human security interests. When I talk about green renewable energy, I'm not talking about nuclear. Some people do lump in nuclear with kind of clean or low carbon energy. I think the nuclear energy sector in the UK is very, very interesting, has its own dynamics, very much linked to the nuclear weapons sector establishments. There's some great work on that by some academics at Sussex University, Andy Sterling and Phil Johnston, but I won't go into that now. It's kind of a separate issue, very, very interesting. But in terms of fossil fuels, first and foremost, we have the power and influence of the fossil fuel lobby in the UK. And it's no coincidence that the two largest UK-based companies, by a large order of magnitude, are oil companies, BP and Anglo-Dutch Shell. Together, their revenues are equivalent to about 30% of the UK government's total revenues. And not all those revenues accrue or are taxable in the UK, they're global. That is a phenomenal size for a company. And with that size and that wealth goes a tremendous amount of influence and lobbying capability. Whether that is just people talking to government, holding meetings with ministers, whether it is giving jobs and opportunities to ministers, civil servants, military, etc. It's big, far bigger than any other sector. There's also, of course, the influence of those companies on the financial markets in the UK, which all our pension funds and so on tend to be invested in. So there's a big influence on the financial sector, which is the sort of dominant sector of our economy overall, which politicians are very reluctant to challenge, particularly if the value of those companies goes down and therefore our collective financial assets seem to diminish. Then there's the way that the state looks at oil companies as levers of British influence around the world. And this is very much connected to Britain as an imperial state that developed oil interests in different parts of the world, whether that was Malaya or Nigeria or the Gulf Emirates before they became independent countries. And when the UK talks about national interests, it's very often talking about the interests of companies registered in the UK. So if you're a country like the UK that wants to talk about its global influence, it's very useful to have these big companies and to be able to talk about their collective presence and assets and interests all over the world if you want to keep looking big. But then comes the the sort of flip side of that, which is a responsibility, as it were, to protect those interests, which leads us to have this particular stance of projecting power, being able to project power with aircraft carriers, with forward bases and various bits of military equipment and infrastructure around the world to protect what we claim to be our interests. The UK is a very particular kind of country in this regard, in that we act very much like a big oil and gas exporting country, which we're not. We were briefly between the late 70s and the early 2000s, about 25 years. But no other country which is a net importer of energy has the same influence of fossil fuel companies in its economy. And the way we act on that in particular is again an imperial legacy of looking to sort of gain influence by protecting the sea lanes of communication on which this oil and liquefied natural gas travels to the world. This is why we have a large navy. It's why we retained bits of territory at almost all of the major choke points on the major sea lanes. So Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, Cyprus for the Suez Canal, bases in Oman and Bahrain around the Straits of Hormuz to the Persian or Arabian Gulf. And so by doing this, we gain influence with not just the producer states who we are seen to be protecting, but also with some of the big consumer states like, say, Japan or Korea, which are dependent on some of these oil supplies coming from the Gulf states in particular. Paul, you talked about CENTCOM emerging in the 70s, which is very much the sort of handover from the UK as a colonial power in the Persian Gulf to a more ancillary role to the US and CENTCOM and the US naval fleet in Bahrain as the protectors of that region. So sort of quid pro quo for that is that we kind of get paid for the protection from these rich producing states, whether that is paying directly for protection, as the Sultan of Brunei, for example, does for British Gurkhas in his country, who happen to be based next to a country's major British oil company base, or whether it's paying us back by buying arms from British aerospace companies like BAE Systems, for example.
Richard, could you perhaps wind up fairly soon?
Yeah, or whether it's investing in London markets. So what does a green energy better world look like? What do we lose by shifting from this geopolitics? Well, we lose some autocratic allies who, frankly, are a major liability. Potentially we lose some value in the markets, but frankly, the markets go up and down tremendous amounts anyway, and the speculation in oil markets is a big problem anyway. We lose some subsidies to the arms industry, discuss that, if you will. And we lose some global influence through this kind of protection racket. But frankly, that's an essential part of the decolonizing agenda of geopolitics as a form of enforced inequality, with the UK very much the top of the pyramid at the expense of other states. And that is something I think we could probably do without. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Richard. I should have said at the beginning that rather than use the raise hands symbol, if we could use the question and answer one, and we'll try and fit in some questions towards the end. But thanks so much for that introduction, Richard, which I think takes us on to where we are now. And I think in a sense, that's a natural way to bring Brook in as the second speaker. So Brook, it's over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm just getting these slides started here. Okay. That should hopefully be working. Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking now on whether UK government policy is achieving energy security, and particularly with a focus on oil and gas production in the UK, which as a case study, which is really the focus of Uplift's work. We've seen energy security becoming incredibly prominent this year, as Paul set out with the war in Ukraine, and a confluence of the discussion in the UK around security and independence framings. We've had Rishi Sunak talking about the UK as being energy independent by 2045. We've had Labour talking about a UK power sector that's independent. But of course, also, as Paul mentioned, this is not a new thing. Fears of the lights going out is a very emotive issue in the UK, because it's back in the 1970s, that was very much the reality. And those politicians are using those same frames today to evoke similar fears and reactions. But yeah, it's really important, I think, to question how the concept of energy security is being used in this moment. So it's excellent that Rethinking Security is diving into this question. At the outset, I wanted to just touch on what is energy security. I spent a short time last year looking at some different definitions in the literature, and there's really hundreds out there. Often the common starting point seems to be around these 4 A's of sort of around availability, affordability, accessibility, and acceptability. In that latter part, you have some of the environmental and societal elements coming in. Some other definitions talk about environmental and social sustainability, environmental stewardship. We then have the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which has just really focuses it on those first 2 aspects of the 4 A's around availability and affordability, and take a narrower definition of energy security. And we see the UK government often in its policies taking a similar approach, or even narrower, and sometimes and often just focusing on the security of supply piece of energy security. And sometimes just framing that as a tension against affordability and decarbonization, rather than thinking about energy security as including those aspects within it. And I think ultimately this ambiguity in meaning provides political cover. Energy security can be used by political actors as a tool to justify the energy policy they want. And I think Richard set out some very good reasons as to the energy policies that are pursued. So thinking about the government's recent approach, I think that these 2 policy documents provide useful examples. The British Energy Security Strategy was announced by the government recently, which really tries this all of the above approach, which seems to be their current strategy. It has some priorities on energy efficiency, doesn't go far enough, but it also at the same time doubles down on oil and gas. It has announcements in it like a new oil and gas licensing round, or this new project regulatory accelerator, which will look to remove some of the environmental and economic checks that we do have in place in the UK. And then in the context of talking about a just transition away from oil and gas, we do have the North Sea Transition Deal, which was agreed last year between the government and industry. But sadly, this is not a deal that transitions us away to a cleaner, more secure energy system. Instead, it really looks to solidify the narrative that oil and gas will continue to be an essential part of the UK's energy system. It sets targets on things like production emissions. So how can we electrify the getting oil and gas out of the ground? So you put a wind turbine on an oil and gas platform. So the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, has described the targets within this deal as inadequate, and analysis shows basically that the industry could meet most of them just by continuing with business as usual. And this is quite unsurprising, really, given that it was essentially written by the oil and gas industry, which Freedom of Information Act request revealed. And also unsurprising is that with these sorts of policies, the centrality of oil and gas remains in UK government policy, in part because the principal objective under the Petroleum Act is also still in place, which is to maximise the economic recovery of UK petroleum. So that is the primary principal objective that drives the work of the North Sea Transition Authority. And so now I thought it would be great to turn to whether oil and gas really brings energy security, and Richard already touched on this as well. But this table, I think, is quite a useful illustration of some of the different options on the table, and how inadequate oil and gas is compared to others. So even on the government's favourite criteria around security of supplies, there's some really clear issues. You can see how long it takes to get an oil and gas field up and running. The time of 28 years, but still it'll be a good 5 to 10 years to get a new field up and running. And the UK continental shelf is an aging basin. A lot of the resources that are easy to extract have been extracted, and it's the tax system in the UK that really props up this industry. Until quite recently, it had one of the lowest tax rates in the world. We now have a temporary increase with the windfall tax, but the permanent taxation regime underlying it is still remains the same. And also from an energy security perspective, it's important to note that what's left is mostly oil, about 70%. And we export about 80% of the oil we produce on an international market. So this framing that the UK production is central to delivering UK energy security really misses a lot of the realities of how the basin is used and who that benefits. And I won't take too long, mindful of time on this slide, because I think, again, Richard touched on some of these points about the impact that oil and gas has on people on the planet. And these, I think, are very important aspects that we need to make sure are part of the conversation when we talk about energy security. But just to say that we are seeing these impacts of rising gas prices on energy bills, and oil and gas, we know, is not the solution to that. It doesn't deliver on the affordability piece of energy security. Renewables are far, far cheaper. Most recently found to be 9 times cheaper than new gas. And the climate impacts into the longer term are also incredibly concerning. We have climate campaigners at the moment opposing the new oil and gas fields like Rosebank. This one oil field would extract fossil fuels that would produce CO2 emissions that are more than the annual CO2 emissions of the 28 low-income countries in the world combined. So keeping in mind the climate impacts, not just in the UK, but around the world, is also important from a security perspective. I was also asked to touch on whether COP27 changed anything. And the UK, of course, handed over the COP presidency just last week in Egypt at COP27, and we had some useful language there around recognizing the necessity of a clean and just transition to renewable energy, but also some concerning language. So this talks about including low emissions and renewable energy in the energy mix that we're seeking to enhance, which some are concerned can open the door not just to renewables, but also to fossil gas. And we also had a failure, once again, for countries to call for a phase out of all fossil fuels. Apparently the UK eventually joined India and other countries this time in the group calling for the language to go beyond coal and to also include oil and gas, but that didn't get agreed in the end. And we're yet to see that sort of ambition in their own backyard with the UK government. So interesting to hear that that's what they're pushing for behind the scenes this time. And we have also a reiteration of the language that came from the Glasgow Climate Pact around phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Again, very interesting to contrast that with the behaviour of the UK government over the past year, with the windfall tax, including a very significant investment allowance, which has been labelled as a huge subsidy essentially for new and ongoing production. So just to wrap up, as the issue of energy security comes to the fore this year, we've seen the government continuing to focus on a very narrow conceptualization, I think, of energy security around security of supply And if we go back to some of the more holistic definitions that I mentioned earlier, we can see that oil and gas is really failing to deliver on many of the facets of energy security. It's not affordable and it's not sustainable. And it also amplifies a huge number of threats into the longer term. By contrast, I think renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies really tick a whole host of boxes from a security perspective. And it's unfortunate the government's not recognizing this in its policy to date. And the last sort of thought I wanted to raise here at the end is just reflecting on the use of energy security in government policy, is whether a security framing is one we want to be reinforcing and encouraging a holistic interpretation of, or is it a frame perhaps we want to move away from? I'm not sure the answer to that, but I have seen some of the discussions around framing and framing of security might activate in terms of sort of evoking a vulnerability, fear, sort of feelings of being at risk. Just questioning and thinking about whether those are the frames that will help us to transform our societies and energy systems, or a different frame might be the one that does that. So yeah, great to have this discussion, and look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Thanks very much indeed, Brook. I was struck particularly by that quote that you put on the penultimate slide from the director of the International Energy Agency. And this is a quote from just last year, saying bluntly that there should be no more investment in oil or gas, full stop. That represents a very big change over quite a few years for that agency, which is much more broadly based, and to some extent it's maybe a very slight sign of hope. But thanks very much for a very sort of comprehensive yet succinct run through of where we are and what sort of tasks we place in Britain. So Sam, if you would like to come in on the last of the main contributions, and just remind people, we do have 1 or 2 questions coming in, and essentially we'll take those at the end of this session. So Sam, over to you if I may now. Thank you.
Great, thanks Paul, and thanks for inviting me along to participate in this panel. I think it's a really important discussion for reasons which I don't need to outline, and clearly Richard and Brook and yourself have touched on these already. So as it was said in the introduction, I'm from Public Commercial Services Trade Union. For those who are not familiar with PCS, we are the main civil service trade union, so we have lots of our members that are working in areas of policy and regulation, for example, around energy policy, and we've been very active for a long time on issues of sustainability and climate change and that bigger question of just transition. And I think I want to start out by making one point, is something which we say is that we're all energy unions. Now, we often get asked the question, why is PCS concerned with issues around energy transition, as we've not directly got members that are working, for example, within the fossil fuel industries. Now, as I've said, we've got members in regulation and monitoring, etc., but not just because of that. I think within the work that I do, for my union, also internationally, what we recognise is that energy is everybody's business. It's part of everything we do. It's enabling us to have this meeting tonight. It's part of our workplaces, industrial processes. It relates to health and transport services, education, food production, and so on. So it's not just about the nature of the energy that we produce, i.e. the input, whether it's fossil fuels, nuclear or renewables. And that is an important part of the conversation, of course it is. But so when we talk about the needs, obviously, of workers for the just transition of meeting the climate goals, we talk about the whole economy and seeing energy as part of a system within that, but asking questions also about what is energy for and who it's for. What role does energy play in our lives? Now, obviously, we've touched on some of these in the previous contributions around issues around some of the geopolitics and stuff, but obviously we have huge energy inequality in the UK and globally as well, and that's reflected around access to energy or affordable energy, and the policies that would address those and also reduce energy demand, and that kind of saying that the best energy is the energy we don't use, or decarbonisation, such as around retrofit and insulation of homes. So I think it often seems contradictory when we're talking about energy security, but it's rarely talked about in terms of meeting basic human needs and seeing energy as a human right and as a global public good. And also, as we've heard, the way our energy system is divided, particularly the economics of it. We've heard a lot of rhetoric, particularly this year, around the energy crisis. And when fracking reared its head again, even some Tories, including Kwasi Kwarteng, admitted this would do nothing for the UK security of supply of energy, and that's because we don't own it, and it doesn't matter. And I'm sure many of you will know, even last year at some point we were producing record amounts of gas out of the North Sea, but because we don't own it, that was being exported and we were buying it back on the international markets, and obviously as consumers at inflated prices. And similarly for renewable energy, yes, costs have come down, but at the moment, because of the market basis energy position of obviously renewable energy is tied to gas prices, and I think it's been quite interesting that in these discussions since the energy crisis, and a lot of people said, well, how come I've got a new renewable energy supplier, but I'm still paying all these prices? So we've got a very confused system and a very confused energy policy, which flip-flops all the time, I think, and that's been illustrated. And this is one of the problems. So, so I think one of the things, obviously as we enter into this winter period now of millions worried about their energy bills, not so much where the electrons come from, because I think right now people are just concerned about how they're going to pay for it, and when they get indoors, flip their switches, and that they're going to have energy, and they're already talking about blackouts this winter as well. And I think we have to be really worried when we're starting to see now talks about energy being prescribed on in the National Health Service, that people just may need to have some kind of energy allowances for heating, for example. The other thing I think we need to guard against is that the energy crisis was not made in Russia, as Jeremy Hunt said in his autumn statement, and as the opposition has supported as well. We've had a energy crisis for a very long time. It predated the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've been in a cost of living crisis for a longer time as well. And solving the energy crisis and also achieving energy security, depending on how we define that, is more about windfall taxes, although it's not to say that support for taking some of those obscene profits of the energy companies is not something we don't support it. But what we should be talking about is addressing the market basis of energy that enables these profits to be possible. So I think just to come to sort of where we are within the trade union movement on this, obviously the whole energy transition and just transition is a huge debate. We have different policy perspectives on it in the UK and globally, depending where you're coming from. As it was mentioned in the introduction, PCS is part of a global trade union initiative, what we call for energy democracy, which advocates for public ownership and democratic control of our power system. And the reason for that is to see it as part of a coordinated and planned approach that would enable a massive scale out of renewable energy, energy conservation measures, and ensure job creation. Now, obviously on its own, ownership of energy doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. Although obviously we do have examples from France, for example, that the caps on some of the prices that France has managed to do, so that the price have risen at a much lower level than in this country. So I think what's been interesting for us, and particularly working on a global basis, but also nationally, at the COP in Glasgow last year, we supported the launch of the Trade Union Programme for a Public Low Carbon Energy Future, which was developed by more than 30 trade unions globally. It mainly focuses on the power sector, but the programme is an attempt to rally the international trade union movement behind an ambitious political effort to bring about a fundamental shift in climate and energy policy, and a shift that we believe is needed to both correct the failures of the market model and to ensure that the energy transition is socially just, economically viable and effective in terms of reaching climate goals, and that has to be set within a framework of climate justice, recognizing energy issues of the global south, new colonial extractivism around rare earth metals and minerals, and this move to new green structural adjustment programs, which is happening in the just energy transition partnerships that one was agreed at the COP this time around for Indonesia and in Glasgow for South Africa, which starts to bring in models of energy transition which are directed by the IMF and the World Bank for loaning the money for that. But I think in this new dash for gas as well, which we're seeing in Africa, or for minerals and rare earth metals as well as part of the green transition, you know, we have to ensure, and this is what we're trying to do as trade unions, as we're arguing for obviously security of jobs through this transition, which is vitally important, that we also recognise this within an international system as well. So I think just to wrap up and to say what our programme is about in brief is about fulfilling the right to energy, reversing neoliberal laws and directives affecting the power sector, enforcing a new pro-public mandate, establishing a public planned approach to energy transition, introducing democratic governance and control, providing a high level of collective guarantees for our employees and workers, publicly fund the energy transition, and establish a global public goods framework for multilateral cooperation. And for us, that's really important. It's not about what we just do nationally in the UK. We have to do this within a global framework and global context. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much indeed, Sam. I was struck particularly by what you were saying at the end about the need for the action on a transnational scale, or basically from trade unions. I think people tend to forget that in the relatively recent past, trade unions in countries such as Britain have been hugely important in the development of trade unions across the global south. And it's an area of international action which I think is really underestimated. So I think it's really good to hear that the PCS is very much engaged in this field and that you're involved in it yourself. We do have some time for questions. We've got some questions coming in, so I'll go through them. The first one came in, there's a slight problem, so I don't know who actually said it, but I'm sure you'll recognize it when I read it out. So just bear with me a minute. Richard points out about independence of supply. I think grids and high voltage direct current, $1 million volt grids, that's a Freudian slip, volt grids with harmony between nations is important. I understand there that if you do have transnational grids at high voltage, then you can actually move large quantities of power pretty quickly, but of course it does require a degree of harmony. But that was in response to points you were making, Richard. So is there anything that you would like to add to that in responding?
Well, I just say I'm no expert at all about how to shift electricity and energy around the world most efficiently. But I think we've seen a big shift in the last decade away from the idea that we would invest in mega schemes like solar energy farms the size of small countries in the Sahara, for example, with mega supply cables to Europe, to something more decentralized, which I think is healthy. Both in terms of not just having the global south as an energy supplier to the global north, as it has been for decades, but in terms of putting communities and people in control of their own generating resources to varying extents. And that's also, as I said, more secure in many ways than having sort of mega connections.
If I can just add a little bit, I think that one of the issues behind many of the problems of trying to develop decarbonisation through use of renewables is the question of storage. And but there are a couple of things I think we have to remember here, and that is that there are essentially, if you look at all the gamut of different sorts of renewable energy, in many ways there are very big overlaps. But what is also happening is really novel versions of storage, which are actually already coming into being. The hydrogen economy is very restricted in what it can do. It isn't suitable for cars, it probably isn't suitable for trucks, but for quite a lot of other areas it is. What you also find is that the very large new wind turbines, we're now getting into 15 megawatt ones. Now, just to say that, 10 by 10 C array of such turbines is equivalent to a sizable nuclear power station. Could be built in less than half the time and probably for a lot less than half the cost. And it goes back to Richard's point about the viability in economic terms of renewables. But the point is, it is now possible to envisage that a turbine like that, which may be producing electricity when it isn't needed, can actually transfer it through its own electrolysis progress, actually built into the machine to produce hydrogen. And that could be stored at that machine and then transmitted, not even go through pipelines. It can be done just by collecting it, so to speak. That is the kind of development which is happening now. And in fact, the first full-scale version of that will be online in about 2 years' time. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there may well be a role for this sort of high voltage grids, but there's also a very strong way in which you link it to the wider issue of what we mean by human security in the energy sector. But let's move on to David Saunders in Bristol. Very interesting one, this. How much of the value would fossil fuel companies lose if required to not extract and sell their assets? Is this the elephant in the room? So is it as easy as to let renewables overtake and let fossil interests wither on the vine? That I think is anybody for that. I know, Richard, it's something that you've thought about, but I'll open it up to Sam and Brook as well. So do you want to have a quick go first, Richard?
Yeah, I don't have a figure for it, except to say that the value of oil companies, gas companies, is very much dependent not just on the volume of the assumed resources they control, and that's not always easy to estimate or evaluate, but on the value in market terms or assumed future market terms for that. So that the stranded assets idea is that they have all these assets, these resources that are of diminishing value over time or worthless. But of course, the energy market is not just about what's available at any time. It's very much about speculation. The reason we have had the gas prices go so high in recent months, down again a lot, is that people are speculating on availability in the next winter timeframe, for example. So there's very much inbuilt instability in pricing and resource costs of management in the hydrocarbon sector in a way that doesn't necessarily apply to wind or wave or solar, etc. power, which is pretty much always going to be there.
Fair enough. Brook or Sam, do you want to concentrate to comment on that, or shall I move on to the next question? We've got some more coming up now. Sam?
I don't know if Brook wants to go. I'll just go quickly then. Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, I think we have to be, and from a trade union and worker perspective, we won't want to just see, this concept of withering on the vine. That's why we need a planned transition. That's the only way we're protect workers. But I think the other point to make as well is that this sort of idea of disruption that will just sort of crowd out the fossil fuel sector is not going to happen. We're not seeing that. We're seeing energy expansion. We're seeing a rise in fossil fuel use as more energy is being demanded. So I think we have to be very careful around those arguments as well, because we're going to need to triple the energy that we need if we're going to electrify everything. So, and this is why we're so focused on about this plan and coordinated approach as well, and which protects workers through that transition.
Yeah. Brook?
Yeah, I might just come in briefly on that. I was going to make a similar point around, we can't just let this wither. We need a plan to phase it out so that communities and workers are protected. I think also important to think about in terms of the withering on the vine idea is that the longevity of the industry at the moment is very much propped up by the tax system in the UK, and production would be winding down at a far greater speed if not for that tax system. So the government at one point recently said in one of the documents that they're not supporting any sort of phase down that's beyond faster than the natural decline of the field, and yet they are very much artificially propping up the decline of the fields at the moment. So that, yeah, has huge implications for a just transition, and particularly globally as well.
Yeah, sure. We've got one here from Wendy. I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer this, but it's a fair point. She says, difficulty with the solar system, I think this is in particular in terms of production of the panels, is the emission of NF3 greenhouse gases that is emitted during their production with an intense global warming effect. Important to be aware of, though I understand it's not directly relevant to this excellent presentation. That is in relation, I think, to Richard's. So yes, I mean, that is an issue, and one always has to remember that just because you're going over to solar or indeed to wind, there is obviously an input in terms of a climate impact with the producing of the systems in the first place. And that has to be factored in. There's an interesting, well, I'm going to just mention one from Graham and then go back to a previous one. Somewhat crazily, Graham says, the UK has been massively subsidizing the import and burning of biofuel and claiming this to be renewable. Does this subject come up at did this subject come up at the recent COP? That's a specific one. I don't know whether Brook, you'd be able to respond to that. I mean, did the whole biofuel issue come up to an extent at the COP27?
I'm afraid I'm not sure. I've only followed on the oil and gas matters. I guess perhaps it has implications for the low emissions and renewable energy pole of the decision, would be my guess.
Fair enough. If anybody wants to go further on that, Carbon Brief a couple of days ago published a really good summary of the whole output of COP27 from a fairly neutral perspective, going into detail. We should be able to find the answer there, but I certainly don't have it to hand. But the question I wanted to lead on to is from dear Linda Eltringham. If a general election is called in 2023 or 2024, which of all political parties is more likely to deliver sustainable energy security for the UK citizen and business? And the just transition being talked about, and is it being talked about, the just transition more generally? So specifically, we're looking at British politics here. So I think Brook and Sam should certainly have first go at that. Sam, do you want to have first go, and then I'll ask Brook if she'd like to comment? Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you know, I'll be quite frank, and this is a personal view. I don't have too much confidence in any of the mainstream parties really delivering on what we need in terms of the energy transition and just transition. Although, you know, there are discussions going on. The Labour Party has a team working with trade unions, not the trade union I represent, but some trade unions, particularly in the energy sectors, which might define themselves as energy trade unions. So there are discussions around that, but I think from our perspective, it wouldn't really go far enough, and certainly not far enough that the 2019 manifesto that Labour Party had then was very excellent, and I would have felt more confident about that. But certainly if it was just a pitch between the Tories and Labour, then certainly Labour would have a far better chance, but I think it falls far short. I think the Great British Energy Company really delivers very little. In reality, it's not about public ownership. It's not about the kind of transition that we're talking about in my union with other unions that are within the same debate on this.
Right. Brook, any addition to that?
Yeah, well, I think similar view in that really, given the performance of the current government, have no confidence in their current plans in terms of the sort of stead that's put people into going into winter, but also sort of looking forward. They really don't have any plans for just transition away from oil and gas at the moment, and if anything, are stalling that. I think we don't yet currently have what we need in terms of Labour proposals either, but I do think they are much further along and on the right track. They recently announced that they would oppose new licensing rounds, which I think is really, those sorts of announcements are what we need in terms of providing certainty to have a managed phase out. So I would certainly have a lot more hope in Labour than the Conservatives.
I suppose a lot of it's going to depend on Miliband, in fact, and whether the things he's saying actually carry much ice. I mean, I think it's, to put it mildly, it's rather interesting that probably the most effective person that I've heard on the BBC radio this week in responding to the need to do much more is actually Lord Devon, who is the chair of the Climate Change Committee, and he is actually a former Conservative cabinet minister who seems to have gone almost over a Damascene conversion, but all power to it, because in a sense he speaks with a particular authority. We've got time for two more questions. I think we just fit them in. One from David Lucas. For energy reduction, we need to move from cars to electrically propelled public transport. Battery propelled vehicles can only be a tiny part of the equation because there's just not enough resources in the world for all the batteries. Also, much more freight must be moved from roads to electric railways. Comments, please. Anybody like to comment on that? Is it more? Sorry, Richard, go on.
I wouldn't comment on the science because I don't know, but reiterate what Sam says about the best energy is the energy we don't use.
Yeah.
Because we've got to massively expand the electricity production in order to electrify things that would have run on sort of internal combustion engines. And that uses a lot of energy, but also the interesting question of the geopolitics of resource supply for green tech, whether that's lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper for batteries or components, or rare earth metals. There are limited supplies of those, and some countries are trying to corner the market in it. For example, this country has its own strategy on that. So that's going to put a lot of pressures on supply chains and on geopolitical pressures as well. So the less we have to do in that regard, the better in many ways.
There's one question here from dear Linda again. She's got a second one in. And it takes us back to a general theme. If people choose to use less and less fossil fuels, gas, petrol, diesel, then the worth value of those resources would by default drop off. It only has value if people insist on using it. How can one ensure the end of fossil fuel subsidies? Just a small point to make here, and that is, I think it's 2 years ago, a company in the United States producing and distributing electricity, concentrating largely on wind, with a total workforce of about 10,000. So it was no small thing. That had a market value more than Esso, than Standard Oil. And that was, I think, a reflection of the whole idea of the value of the oil receding into an era of needed decarbonization. But on this specific one, how can one end fossil fuel subsidies? Is there anything anybody can say on that? Kind of perhaps start with Brook and Sam, who is sort of more at the forefront of this. I mean, how do you sort of concentrate on this extraordinary situation of subsidizing things which prevent decarbonization?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the oil and gas production in the UK piece, it's one of many subsidies for fossil fuels within the UK economy. But I think that's one place the government could certainly start, because at the moment, with their latest announcements, the new investments in oil and gas would get 91% relief often. So if for every pound that a company spends on a new field over the next few years under the latest legislation, they're going to get 91p back, which is just an extraordinary subsidy that really takes us in the wrong direction and is decreasing the support that could go to households for measures like energy efficiency, which would allow them to really reduce their use of fossil fuels. So I might pass it to others for other examples, conscious of time.
Well, I think we'll probably have to bring it to an end here, because I must just say a few words about what Rethinking Security is about. People who know about it then turn off now if you wish, but for those who don't, Rethinking Security essentially is a group which has been established in Britain 4 or 5 years, and essentially it changes the conversation, or tries to, on security in public policy as well, away from the absolute concentration on international security with a very military tinge. It's really very much more an advocate of civil society involvement in the whole debate about what we mean by security. It's a point I made at the start. Somebody who's facing real fuel poverty, particularly with young children in a household, that is the security issue for that person. We simply don't sort of recognize that in Britain by and large. And so what Rethinking Security is trying to do, and it's basically a network of about 20 different organizations headed by a small team. Richard, I should also mention Joe Frew, who's been the technical person behind the scenes this evening. And of course, anybody can be involved. So I would very much encourage you to look at the blogs it puts out, what it is doing, and also actually check out the website, which site from memory is www.rethinkingsecurity.org. With that, I have to thank our participants, Richard, Sam, and Brooke. It's been a fairly tight meeting this evening with a lot coming out. I hope you find it useful. Please do give Richard feedback to Rethinking Security in terms of how we got on with this, and to Joe as well. And essentially, we will leave it at that.